Geoffrey G. O'Brien, visiting from, what should I say, from Berkeley via Iowa City. Geoffrey is an assistant professor at Berkeley, but he's currently a visiting professor at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. I will keep my introductory remarks to a minimum because these talks are an informal part of the series. But I do want to just mention that I had a wonderful class session yesterday teaching Geoffrey's book, Green and Gray, to Advanced Poetry Workshop, where the book prompted a conversation about everything from affect and minimalism to ways of writing about war to the nature of simile and how similes are embedded in lyric writing. And it was an unusual pleasure to have work of contemporary poetry turn into such a productive text in that kind of setting. So the students, the class, and myself learned a lot from O'Brien's poems, but we have a lot to learn from O'Brien as a critic and scholar as well. He's written difficult poets, ranging from Michael Palmer to a writer like John Ashbery, who are very different writers, but share in a kind of ethos that comes out in O'Brien's work as well. And I've learned ways of reading these poets from his criticism on their work. So we're here today to hear O'Brien talk about poetry, and tomorrow we'll hear him read poetry. So we're very lucky to have him performing both functions for us while we're here today. After the talk, we'll have a break and pizza access. And then while we eat, we can kind of start a kind of question and answer session with Geoffrey. And he said he's welcoming our going off-road into more contemporary texts. But to begin with, he's going to start by talking about Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Please join me in welcoming Geoffrey G. O'Brien.
Thank you, Chiku. I'm honored to be here, and thank you to Kate Soto as well for helping bring me here. And yes, let's think of this talk as just that which is prior to the pizza access. Okay. I am going to deliver a slightly formal talk in this informal setting, and afterwards we will informalize radically. My talk is called The Left Margin, or Crossing Brooklyn Ferry into the Dusk-Charged Air, because I'm going to speak about both the Whitman poem and the Ashbery poem, Into the Dusk-Charged Air. So my talk today is about the left margin, that space of re-inauguration. Oh, I'm sorry, let me say that I have packets for you to follow along as I speak about the poem. Okay. My talk today is about the left margin, again, that space of re-inauguration that has traditionally been emphasized, perhaps almost by default, when a poet deliberately refrains from using traditional right margin resources, such as rhyme, or even meter, which, though everywhere in the line, finds its identity only when completed at line's end. I'll be looking at two poems about a century apart, Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry and Ashbery's Into the Dusk-Charged Air, for what they can tell us about left margin activation and its relation to an abstention from other poetic forms and figures. I want to talk about the left margin not merely because it's crucial in these two poems, but because, as the site of an intense repetition, it actually doesn't indicate an abstention from right margin resources so much as a reproduction of their effects by other means and in a new location. This matters to me as both a practitioner and a reader for two reasons. One, because we seem to be living in a time in which most of those right margin forms feel unavailable, overfreighted with bad histories or standing as nostalgic, falsifying pattern consolations for the abyssal complexity and damage of everyday life. And two, because even if rhyme and meter are currently nearly vitiated, I think that their effects must be produced by other means. Otherwise, poetry suffers an actual loss of system complexity rather than simply enjoying a permutation of method. In other words, poetry can ecstatically or soberly give up any one form, but when it gives up form with a capital F, I'm not sure it's still a genre. If I had more time, I might argue that rhyme and meter should not be so easily abandoned or left to the neo-formalists, but instead I'm going to end on a possible group discussion, after some pizza, of some contemporary work, which I've Xeroxed at the back of the packet that you have with you. And on the grounds of that work, which includes an excerpt from Kevin Davies' Lateral Argument and a short poem by Graham Faust, maybe we can consider why intense patterning of any kind in any location might be less common now, and how and why we might try to retain it, if only and always by other means and in new locations. So, to the ferry. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry's original title was Sundown Poem. The present title, which dates from the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass, preserves in a culted fashion the therelessness of literary signs and scenes so palpable in the original, in Sundown Poem. All titles, however deictic or world-building, imply the word poem after them, and so establish literary space at space's expense, an immaterial commons in which we read not of things, but of dispositions toward the thingly. But in changing the title to Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, Whitman also announces the literarity of place in more roundabout fashion, through a serious pun on both crossing and ferrying. It's a poem that records a difficulty with figure, specifically with metaphor, and evidences a desire to abstain almost entirely from it, to cross metaphor's ferrying, to thwart its conceptual crossings of terms. In Specimen Days, Whitman said of ferries, quote, "I have always had a passion for ferries. To me, they afford inimitable, streaming, never-failing, living poems." What ferries apparently do, for Whitman, is afford a certain kind of poem via a certain kind of motion, streaming as a metonymic motion across a local space, or at least a selected, representative, perceptual inventory of that space, a catalogic, in which each set member, tide, wake, barge, flag, foundry, contributes to the dissolution of actual place, but in so doing convenes a commons not only immaterial but atemporal or transhistorical, allowing access to a placeless place at any time. In other words, Whitman will prefer metonymic streaming to metaphorical crossing in this poem because he thinks deictic indications of an unvisitable place allow others, readers, future travelers on actual ferries, a better entry to this commons than the private or idiosyncratic transmutations of metaphor. But what does that have to do with the left margin? It's simply the site of another important for, P-H-O-R, anaphora. Instead of a metaphor's ferrying across, we have in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry anaphora's constant vertical stream of carrying back, which is what anaphora actually means etymologically. So that each line, participant in anaphoresis, is a kind of motion that carries with it the threat and ecstasy of getting nowhere, of getting to get nowhere again and again, and leave that thereless there again. Further, anaphora doesn't only emphasize both a vertical patterning of line beginnings, but the horizontal motion of reading across the lines in order to get back to the next emphatic re-beginning. So that a metonymic motion across the possible inventory of things seen in a specific time and place, say Brooklyn in the 1850s, while standing motionless on a moving boat, is attended by an emphasized motion across the material space of the page as well, and the line, in order to return to more such streaming motions. One crosses a line that tells of a crossing. But just as the poem's title fantasizes that the crossing is eternal, uncompleted, one ends up at the beginning again. The form has the potential for infinite extension, but is dependent on a persistent return to its launch, what Ashbery will later call, quote, the mooring of starting out. This is Whitman's idea of time travel, a literary passage through no place that by getting nowhere gets every when. The poem is time machine, with both abstention from metaphor and an attention to anaphora as the controls. as section 3 begins, and you can turn in the packet to that. Quote, "It avails not, time nor place, distance avails not. I am with you, men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence." End quote. And just to prove it, Anaphora breaks out, a series of jests, repeating enough times in succession that we hear it not only as a way of conjuring likeness or kinship across persons without eradicating difference, quote, "Just as you look on the numberless masts of ships and the thick-stemmed pipes of steamboats, I looked," but also as an assertion of the justness or justice of that way of seeing. Men and women are iterably linked across generations by their iterable access to a passage over and through the details of world. Put another way, the only way to turn the unpredictable substitutions of metaphor into a public good is by using metonymy. As the eye roves across boats and up or down their masts and pipes, it establishes an untransfigured, though radically selected, list of those details that theoretically any other person could also perform. It produces, in other words, a substitutability of person by indicating perceptual surfaces while refusing to substitute one thing for another. And again, to go back to section 2 for a second, we can see the canniness of resolutely linking metonymy to anaphora in the section in which the form anaphora is first introduced. Just as metonymy tells the parts without transforming them, so anaphora, as the brute repetition of identity, of a term, does not substitute. It accretes, it emphasizes, it varies across each local lineal environment, but it doesn't replace itself. In other words, it makes a crowd of exchangeable yet serial terms. And here we get a cascade of definite articles, of thus fronting a crowd of parts, which then gives way to a crowd of literal, quote, others, an orchestrated handoff from the definite to the indefinite that is also a drama of forms migration from the right margin to the left. After 5 lines beginning with the, introducing nearly metaphorically the metonymic aspirations of the poem, its telling of, quote, glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings, the 6th line adumbrates the next anaphoric chain by starting the others. And after asserting a, quote, tie between temporally isolated others, the stanza ends with that very word others on the right margin, only to have the poem cross the white space to find the same word waiting for it on the left, where it will, just like the, serve as a formal device for introducing the available sites of percepts of place, what Bertrand Russell would later call sensibilia, or unsensed sense data. The anaphora will then model the substitutability of persons capable of pursuing those percepts. Other is Whitman's pronoun for both the person substituted out and the person substituted in. Everyone is that other. Crossing is the verb for that just and never completed substitution of persons, and the ferry, both place and boat, figure and sign, the streaming, never-failing poem, is the insubstantial commons of perception, where such substitutions can transpire. Whitman, then, is not himself representative. He is merely, if incantatorily, indicative. On the left margin of a line that will continue after him and which preceded him, but also able to stop somewhere waiting for you by sending his bodiless form through time. We also see in this section anaphora's substitution of one term for another within a continuity of its pattern. The poem streams through a left margin emphasis while moving from the to other. Much like the good substitutability of person, the poem prefers to metaphor's private transmutations of figure. Substitution can happen as long as it's linked to metonymy or anaphora. You can use a simile if it's to describe the glories like beads of multiple seeings and hearings, and you can see that episodality of attention as a figure for anaphora as well. Perhaps we could even say that for Whitman, anaphora is the visual figure for a democracy of perception, and metonymy is the narration of that democracy. Which would explain another key moment in the poem where good substitutions of various kinds happen via an abstention from explicit metaphor and an emphasis on anaphora. In section 4, after the first lines first person, I, which speaks of iterated crossing the river of old, we get a new vertical river of anaphora where each anaphoric term not only repeats very few times before giving way to the next, but we also encounter a powerful expansion of what can count as anaphora. Because as we move from watched to 3 saws in a row, to had my eyes dazzled, to 4 looks in a row, back to saw twice, before resolving back to the familiar anaphoric the, we move from an anaphora of term to an anaphora of class, in which synonyms for visual tellings have their time and place, tell the selected metonymies of, quote, parts of bodies and white sails and rigging, and then let other words tell other parts of the witnessable scene. It's as though anaphora's internal logic led to synonymy, as each term's new context morphs into an ability to replace the vision term entirely, while maintaining a kinship, a tie, as Whitman might put it, with the others. Even the lines that don't participate in even mild anaphora, whose first words are not, therefore, repetens, seem part of it retroactively. I, as the site, pardon the pun, of iterable observation, and watched as potential anaphor, and had my eyes dazzled as phrasal substitution for any of the other repetens of vision. Beyond these good substitutions, term for term and term for class, and the flags of all nations, rather than any one of them, there is also a figuring of the poet that verges on metaphor here, that dares the reader to metaphorize him and dares him not to, and thus is worth looking at briefly. When the poet looks at, quote, the fine centrifugal spokes of light around the shape of my head in the sunlit water, he is tempting us to make of him a Jesus, that master figure for substitution, or that other one, a monarch. But in either case, the figure is only a reflection in the water, and the halo simply centrifugal spokes of light pointing along other vectors of vision to other great or small parts of the scene, and the crown a dissolving crown, as protean and inconstant as the water's surface in the, quote, white wake left by the passage. Whitman is a lowercase Christ here rather than the Christ, or a king only insofar as he's able to see himself as other, as reflection, at a distance that avails not because it is instantly crossable, but because there is a metonymic method of crossing to it that makes it permanently available to any person leaning over a rail, to revisit and there be crowned as the king of the others, of which she herself is one. Because of time constraints, I need to move now to the last section of the poem, section 9, where we experience a further expansion of anaphora, this time from an anaphora of synonymy to an anaphora of mood. This section begins with a set of imperatives that are perhaps the least imperious in all of literature. From flow on, river, to live old life, all of the instructions are pyrrhic. All of the commands are already being followed. It is for me a mark of the poem's formal power and ambitions that one doesn't instantly experience as absurd, live old life, or any of the other demands that the world keep doing what it is already doing. The softness of the anaphora, a repetition of grammatical mood, echoes the softness of these enjoinders in the service of yet more metonymic and deictic presentation of place, and the dissolution and reconstitution of that place as literature. For Whitman, such faint linking and such muted commands distinguish his form from the imperious Eucharist of metaphor, which tells a thing to suddenly be another, rather than lovingly telling its parts, and their shading off into the next available object or person. In the last section of this poem, the poet commands the space he's brought under description to be itself, so that it can wait, untransfigured, for anybody else to experience. Even the authority of a lowercase Jesus is told to go, but only told to go by being what it was, light. Quote, diverge fine spokes of light from the shape of my head or anyone's head in the sunlit water. These spokes, a fine play on speaking, as well as a direction to move radially into everywhere else, only diverge rather than suffer expulsion, and leave the poet's head in the water only as, just as, they would leave anyone else's, and remain attached to that from which they diverge. Then, with these commands all followed, because already underway, the anaphora shudders and falls forward into a line become clear apostrophe. Quote, appearances, now or henceforth, indicate what you are. This line also indicates another consequence of this new class of anaphora, this anaphora of mood. It has been engaging in an activity verging on pathetic fallacy, on the lending of agency to the features of place. But is that metaphor here? Not exactly. I would describe it instead as the instantiation of a commons. Because there is no place in literary language, Whitman here does not address place. He actually addresses the crowds of ferrygoers and readers who might encounter a river mid-flow and an old life living itself. Here the pathetic fallacy doubles as, or finds its verity, in the identification of the future persons who will witness similar seeings and hearings, and who are therefore already inside the things they will see. All of this functioning also as an assertion of the continuity across time, the beadedness of such perceptual encounters with world. Commanding appearance to appear is simply to indicate potential experience. And to indicate potential experience is to suggest, or at least fantasize, the good substitutability of the others who could have their eyes be dazzled by it, also, now or in the future. At this point in the poem, in the placelessness of the poem, there is no difference between metaphor and metonymy, because there are no things. There is just the poem, as the commons of potential relations between all its parts, great and small. And now, after staging the breakdown of an anaphora of apparent pathetic fallacy, the poem can permit itself finally any figure, as though it refused to fetishize any one formal procedure for inviting the reader to enter its time machine. It tells its own methods to disperse like spokes of light, and it arrives at one of its most famous phrases and an unabashed metaphor. After the penultimate stanza ends in the brief re-establishment of an anaphora of Pyrrhic command, on the line, keep your places, objects, than which none else is more lasting, it arrives at the line whose right margin offers an undeniable metaphor. You have waited, you always wait, you dumb, beautiful ministers. The obvious antecedent of these ministers is the objects of the line above it. So this phrase is guilty of participating in apostrophe, pathetic fallacy, you name it. But the figure is as strange as it is conventional. How can a minister be dumb? Like and unlike the blind mouths of the bad clergy in Lycidas, another poem of water and roving peripatetic form, these beautiful ministers make a figure that is difficult to cognize, yet pretty easy to comprehend. They are dumb because they are objects, but they are ministers because they are in the poem. Just as a light can be spokes around a head, objects can speak, can only speak when in the poem, where all things are not what they are not even appearances that could indicate what they are. They are only poetic signs, which are also dumb, but which can speak, and the place where persons can meet and share their just ases with each other. And just like the physical facts of world, which wait without any agency for people to perceive them, the sensibilia or unsensed sense data of a place, so too do the poetic signs that dissolve that world in the act of referring to it wait. They wait to issue the soft command to read them, to do what you are already doing. And they do this under the title Sundown Poem, and through a renaming as Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and revisions across the editions, the generations of Leaves of Grass, in a kind of immortality that depends on having no body, but staying in the earthly heaven of text, on a boat that is no metaphor, permanently crossing between two shores. And there are two shores reached at the end of the poem, but they are sounds, not places, and they sound only the poetic sign, while it talks of offering metonymy rather than whole place. In a repetition free of both anaphora and metaphor, the last two lines of the poem say, furnish your parts, enough times, twice, furnish your parts, that we can cross from furnace to shore until we hear, until we hear the shore formed in the crossing. I will turn from that to Ashbery's Into the Dust-Charged Air. which follows Crossing Brooklyn Ferry in your packet. In Ashbery's Into the Dusk-Charged Air, from the volume Rivers and Mountains, we are still dealing with rivers. But the metonymic passage here is through an encyclopedia rather than through a fiction of space. And I should say that Ashbery actually composed this poem with a huge encyclopedia of the rivers of the world by his side in the American Lending Library in Paris. So it truly is a passage through an encyclopedia. In other words, this is a poem that takes as a given what Whitman worked so hard to establish, that language is the world and the world language. It shares, though, with Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, an interest in avoiding epiphanic extraction from nature, while still wanting to make dumb things speak. But its non-transformation of the physical world doesn't require an abstention from metaphor, because there is no physical world, just words in a poem composed primarily of names from a book. Ashbery's poem does, however, find it necessary to privilege the left margin over the right as the site of formal action, perhaps because, as with Whitman, right margin resources seem the sign of a static arrival rather than the mooring of starting out. Let me start by naming the rules of the poem, because while it is not written in a recognizable form, its local laws are patent and left margin accentuating. So, 1, all lines will be initial capped. This is true of Ashbery in general, but it will have a very specific local effect here. 2, one river will be mentioned per line. 3, there will be no stanzas. But there are some exceptions to these rules. 2a, no rivers in a line happens 4 times. 2b, 2 rivers in a line happens 8 times. 2c, 1 river in a line happens a few times, as if none did, or 4 did, because of capitalization. I'll talk about this later, but like remember August, hilarious, the Canadian, has 4 capitalized words in it. And then 3a, there's 1 drop line where the poem threatens to end or break, but doesn't entirely. And 3b, there is 1 stanza break, long after we've assumed that there will be none. And then there are upper and lower limits of frequency implied by these rules, such as 1, there will be no fewer than 1 capitalized word per line and no more than 4 such words per line. And general boring rules of punctuation interact with the poem's local laws, such as 1, the word immediately after a period will be capitalized. I go on at such length because the poem's relation of its exceptions to its intense rules is fascinating. In both cases, the rule and the exception, the poem's relentless goal is to make river names seem like words, and words seem like river names, through their mutual susceptibility to capitalization. And at the point at which this effect becomes possible or even unavoidable, in a line like, remember, August, period, hilarious, the Canadian, where we mistake a month for a river, an adjective hilarious merely capitalized because after a period for a river, and a river Canadian for an adjective because it is one and because of its line position, we also ultimately might mistake remember for a river too because it's capitalized. Or in refusing to see it as one, we risk re-seeing all the other capitalized words as only that, capitalized. And at such a point, or in such a crisis, boring as it might be, we arrive at what I have to call an anaphora of capitalization. Each left margin word's unthought capital is slowly charged across the poem, until by the end we don't know for sure which rule is being followed, the capitalization of a proper name or of a line's beginning. It's also a poem that remembers another anaphoric river poem, the one with which I began my talk. In the middle of page 19, a brief set of entirely powerless commands breaks out that recalls the Pyrrhic instructions of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Quote, better that the Indus fade in steaming sands, let the Brazos freeze solid, and the Wabash turn to a leaden cinder of ice. The Marañón is too tepid, we must find a way to freeze it hard. These commands are not even always or entirely commands, so much as ecstatic exclamations of the speaker's irrelevance to or freedom from natural process, and, conversely, actual places material irrelevance to the poetic sign. But it is as if Crossing Brooklyn Ferry flares briefly in this poem, not merely because it is also a poem about a river, but because Whitman's poem is also about the textual river of Anaphora and other ties of form that happen on the left margin rather than only on the right. This useless imperative string, therefore, has the effect here of further charging an initial cap rule with anaphoric value, borrowing Whitman's explicit anaphora by metonymically referring to his method. But unlike Whitman's poem, Ashbery's will not surrender its intense rules at its close. The poem is, from its very beginning, tending towards its end, despite how long it takes to get there, and through its risk of not having much reason to go on, nor having any particular reason to stop. The place to which it wants to get is not actually a place, but a convergence of forms, where a river name, and here we're at the very end of the poem, actually lands on the left margin. In the poem's penultimate line, Thwaite, cold, is choked with sandy ice. The Thwaite is a special case in the poem, even though it perfectly obeys all the poem's rules. The Thwaite, part the, part wait, finally occupies the left margin, so that we are either unsure which rule it follows, initial capitalization or the capitalization of proper names, or we are sure that it follows two rules simultaneously, both word and name. This new word name, or name word, even incorporates the definite article into its name by breaking cleverly on the definite article in the line above it, the, wait for it, Thwaite, and by surrounding itself with definite article emphasizing left margin river mentions, the Var, the Ardèche. Which leads me to mention another general rule of the poem, which also converges in the word name Thwaite. Each river name must take the definite article. It seems almost as silly to mention this as to have mentioned that the word right after a period will be capitalized. Rivers can take no other article because they are nonce words, names, and therefore definite. But this is a poem that uses local laws to examine our thoughtless acceptance of the general laws of naming localities, the contingency of such names. And it is capable of making the capitalized the before Var and Ardèche look as much like a river as Thwaite looks like a word and sounds like two flowed together. This convergence on the left margin is therefore both the breaking of the heretofore simpler anaphora of capitalization and its further emphasis. But it happens in an archivally familiar stanza, the quatrain, which comes as coda to the nearly interminable and quantitatively unrecognizable block stanza above it. It is the space and shape of a coda, but seems to contain only more of the same relentless generation from rule that characterized the rest of the poem. If the poem had no apparent reason to go on once its rules were firmly established, and no reason to end before its inventory is exhausted, which it's not, then this late break is more of the same double reasonlessness, a stopping that only allows restarting, a strophic figure for brute repetition, and even a visual figure for anaphoras restarting without a difference. And yet it is also, as we've seen, full of ultimacy and consequence. The final convergence of rules, the rest of the poem must now be seen as both a preparing for and a deferral of. But none of that explains the quatrain, a form I associate with right margin effects of both rhyme and meter, especially in ballad or hymn, rather than with this double emphasis on the left margin as the site of converging rules. The answer may lie in the very last line, which is in Alexandrine, an outlying metrical line, already faint in English, and fainter still at the end of a non-metrical poem. Between the quatrain and the Alexandrine that caps it, we have enough traditional form here to begin to see the poem's local laws as the by other means that poetry needs when it eschews received forms. By placing its own laws within the most traditional of stanzas after having risked utter stanzalessness, and in letting a meter have the last word, into the dust-charged air sends itself into the already full insubstantiality of the literary record, reattaching its idiosyncratic forms to those of the extant tradition, and suggesting that it is not, in its difference from those forms, all that different. Anaphora is the rhyme of the left margin. Thank you. Jump away, but but I just wanted to indicate a couple of the things that I have here at the end of the packet. Just an excerpt from the beginning of a long poem by Kevin Davies called Lateral Argument. I wanted to photocopy it for you, both because it's an example of a nearly formless form, of a kind of modeling of haphazardness of stanza construction, but also because of its epigraph. Persons exist as practical ways of speaking about bundles, right? Which seems to be the opposite of maybe a really intact and easy to cognize form, which would be a bundle that was a practical way of talking about persons. And I'm wondering how we got to this place where there's an interest in producing an unrecognizable form or an impalpability of form that feels really attractive to a bunch of serious practitioners right now. I'm not against it. I just don't want it to rule out intense patterning also. I think that they can coexist. And I'll just say one last thing about what I think might be at work in forms whose form is really hard to grasp. I think we live in a moment, as I said at the beginning, where the therelessness of literature characterizes our experience of system as well off the page, material conditions of everyday life. It's ungraspable. It's too complicated. We're a system of facts rather than, intact entities. And for these reasons, like the permanent dream of literature to be a mimetic medium that captures something about what it's like in the world, how it is to live now, might sometimes think that the best way to mime this ungraspability of system is not to provide a pattern that one can follow. So that you mime systems ungraspability by producing a haphazardness of visual distribution of language on the page, right? And I think that's at work in the epigraph here as well, where speaking about bundles can either be the threat of fascism, right, this horrible way of bundling things, or it can describe a loose organization of form that might be more anarchic and regenerate instead. And I think that Davies is talking about both kinds of bundles. But a little bit further on...
You might be talking about, little bundles of joy.
Yes, could also be. And what are those little bundles of joy but things that are going to grow up to be workers in system of facts, but could also be poets, right? They could be either thing. But there's a moment in the poem where a moment of anaphora breaks out. If you look on page 40 and 41, towards the bottom of 40, hold me tighter by the animals, but then suddenly in Summit, New Jersey, in an anonymous industrial park, in the flickering timescape, in. It's almost as if he's channeling Whitman for a second, except here it seems like rather than this being a thing that links people in this possibility of perceiving place over and over again in this democratic way in which the poet refrains from saying anything about the place, these kind of feel to me like isolated instances rather than beaded instances, right? They don't feel grouped like the beads on a chain so much as a way of thinking about how everything is fractured and sealed off from other things and how we're all sort of flying blind or in dramatic irony about what system is doing to and with us. So just as the Pyrrhic commands flare briefly in Ashbery's poem from Whitman's poem, here Whitman's anaphora flares briefly but to an entirely different effect.
That goes along with the content of what he's saying there, too. I mean, moving from panel to panel, noting elements of the collage, we assume that that's not mere metonymy, but rather radical fracturing of some kind.
Right. Right. As if, right, it's the sadness of times and places and persons not being aware of each other, rather than the joy of there being something held in common, even if nobody in each location is aware of the fact that they're holding it in common. I don't want to keep talking. I want to hear something from you guys, but I do think that one of the questions that my talk implies is why has this come to pass? I've given you a provisional answer that the bid to describe world may require avoiding certain kinds of highly ruled systems. The corollary, why is it that meter and rhyme have become so verboten, is not exactly implied by that first answer, right? Because is there any reason why those forms couldn't be used to produce abyssality, right? To produce complexity? So that's my question to you.
I just I'm being naive. But I want to talk a little bit about the first two lines of CrossingBrooklyn Ferry, where he's, flood tide below me, I see you face to face, clouds at the west, sun there half an hour high, I see you also face to face. Those hearken to some of the bedrock of normal, sort of canonical Whitman criticism, this gesture toward prophecy, the notion of his reliance upon the King James Bible, and I'm wondering, how would you incorporate then? I'm thinking King James Bible is a face-to-face, just to be clear, and then I think that many people have argued that the Anaphora of Whitman is based upon a biblical Anaphora, and so we have here perhaps something that's ungraspable, precisely because it falls within a tradition of mystic poetry and this sort of prophetic vein. I don't think that necessarily negates your hypothesis. I just wonder how how to incorporate these kind of biblical elements that are in the
Well, I think in the talk I tried to some extent suggest that there's a movement away from the temptation to see Whitman as seeing himself as a capitalized Christ or Jesus, and into a lower casing and sort of lateral availability of that position.
That's what I'm thinking, the prophet.
Right.
I don't know.
But he's a prophet that anybody can substitute in for, at least in his own words. Right, that anybody can occupy that position and nobody gets to occupy it for too long. So I would say that, yes, of course the Anaphora is biblically based and King James based, but I think that what he's doing with it in this location is much like what he's doing when he lowercases Jesus or Christ, by making it simply a reflection in the water, which is what's happening here as well. Like, is he apostrophizing the flood tide, or is he actually already seeing himself in the water as he leans over the rail? Well, he's doing both.
Yeah, it seems that both gesture that you see in the end actually is happening at that very beginning,
Yes.
because you have the flood of, the flood.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And this notion that brings you face to face with God. And death, which is, coming upon the person, also that moment of coming face to face with God, as well as, the sort of possible undoing and metonymic readings that you're
And redoing as well as undoing. But I also think that everything you're saying is not only there, but it's there in part as a kind of temptation at the beginning of the poem before we've passed through its sort of democratizing forms of anaphora. And then we'll get to it at the end when it's rehabilitated, when we're aware that metaphor is actually a moment of good substitution rather than bad substitution because of everything it's passed through in the poem. And it's also not true that there are no other metaphors besides beautiful dumb ministers. I was expecting to get skewered for this, right? Like there's the... Go ahead.
No.
Okay, well, I was going to say... I was just going to say, I forget exactly where it is, but there's one where these white fleeces are tinged with violet or something, right? When he's describing clouds as if they're the coats of sheep, having departed from actual sheep. So, yes, that's a metonymic way of referring to sheep, but it sure as hell is a metaphorical way of referring to clouds. So why is he capable of doing that? When it's early enough in the poem that by my reading it shouldn't be able to happen. Well, I'd say that the poem often has these temptations to fall into metaphor and out of the just way of seeing and re-seeing the world. And that particular one is one that's certainly allowing you to think pastoral, particularly, and perhaps even making fun of pastoral. And in a poem that I think is really referencing Lycidas in several locations, I think we're seeing another attempt to sort of deny pastoral, what Empson calls the stuffing of the complex into the simple, right? He wants to proliferate a worldliness of things in this space that's supposed to be cleared out and simple so the shepherd can sing. And so I think that moment of metaphor is a moment where if you're the bad kind of reader or haven't been taught by the poem yet, you're going to fall into being in a pastoral idyll. And if you're not, you're going to understand that you should refrain from seeing that metaphor as an important location in the poem, or what's important about it is that you abstain from his moment of indulging metaphor. And the last thing I'd say is that that's not the last metaphor in the poem either. But the other metaphors that we get are strangely immaterial from the get-go. They're things like struck from the eternal float of solution or impalpable sustenance, right? They're already in this vague space that metaphor produces by crossing its terms. But there are no physical concretions that are being crossed to produce that abstraction. So a metaphor that already begins by using abstract terms in which you can't see the X and Y that are bred together to make that abstraction seems to be a kind of metaphor he's willing to have, because it's not a transmutation of physical place. And that's
the
in
the mystic tradition then, would you think? I mean, could that possibly be read as well that way?
Sure. Why not? Yeah.
I wanted to introduce a counter term, which is sort of coming up already in Kelly's question about biblical, because it seems as though they're going from biblical anaphora to civic anaphora is what is, is what's involved, or religious to secular, and I guess when the counter term, I guess, would be predication. So when one reads weak prose, particularly weak academic prose, one sees the weakness in the predication. That is to say, verbs are buried under seams and tens and so forth, and because of a kind of reluctance to predicate anything as being a sort of characteristic of academic writing at its worst, and that's kind of related to what to, let's say, the Pyrrhic imperatives, which element of Whitman has been used to denigrate him. Say, terrible writer. Look at this. I mean, stand, wall, or whatever. Whatever. And so I guess I'd like to know what you, since you speak appreciatively of and convincingly of Into the Dust-Charged Air, which is just from start to finish this kind of impulse that is to write a poem without predicating anything really, and that's why is that not something to be critical of? Why is that something not to be regarded as a trivialization of poetry?
Okay, so
it's not a hostile question.
No,
I just
sure.
want to I want to, since you're able to speak cogently in appreciation of these features of style that other people have spoken of negatively.
Right.
Would you struggle a little bit with the people who hate this kind of thing?
Yes, I will struggle with those of you who are in that category. So as I understand the question, the point is, why isn't it horrible that there's zero predication into the dust-charged air? And I would say that predication is a rhetorical term rather than a formal term, obviously, right? We're not using it to think about the ends of sentences. And I would say that if we can make it a formal term, then that's where predication is happening once a certain other kind of rhetorical predication has been totally dissolved. So I'll give you some examples from Into the Dust-Charged Air from the very beginning. On the first page, on page 17, the dominant verb, to talk about verbs that do or do not change in bad predication, like subtend or seems or attempts, almost the only verb we get on this first page is versions of the verb flow. Right? So and it takes a while to get it, but finally we get the Irrawaddy is overflowing. We get the Isar flows too fast to swim in. The Amstel flows slowly. What else do we have there? The Sion flows silently. The Shannon flows swiftly. And then my favorite, after the Harlem flows amid factories, the Nelson is in Canada, line break. Flowing. Okay, so what we have here is a refusal to engage in anything but a trivial surface difference within a single verbal, right? So we have overflowing, flowing. It can take different adverbs like swiftly and silently, but there isn't going to be some profusion of verbs of manner of motion for what rivers do. And I think what happens is that at that point is much like we need to see words as river names and river names as words in the poem because of the capitalization rules. We have to see the refraining from variation there as actually a joyful subdivision, a sort of Zeno's paradox, where what happens within flow is an example of how fecund and delightful and pleasurable refusing to say anything particular can be, right? So that we see the particularity of the refusal to say itself become this beautiful formal cascade of changes across that first page of the poem. And that's about as good as I can get. That, like, when you dissolve a rhetorical predication, your return to the poetic sign is a place where these kinds of virtuosic ringings of changes on even a single boring verb can happen. In other words, much as the Whitman poem is sometimes daring you to metaphorize wrongly or to resist metaphorization correctly, this is a poem that's testing whether you're going to be bored by it or, after an initial space of boredom, find all these subsequent experiences of pleasure within the boredom that it's not going to keep giving to you. Does that begin to slightly answer?
It does. So if we go on a little bit, so if you were teaching the poem and you were giving a lecture and you made this presentation and you did so at Berkeley, it would be altogether plausible that somebody would say, who cares about this kind of finery, verbal finery, when there's the war here and there's this, that, and so on and so forth? Don't poets have anything more to say about the status quo than this?
Right. Well, I mean, so first of all, I would say, who cares about the poem of extracting human essences from the natural world while wars are going on as well? So in terms of that question of what a relation to nature in the context of the poem is, I don't think it matters whether you're the boy of Winander or you're writing into the dust-charged air, right? But in terms of the question of whether this is a kind of fiddling while Rome burns, so that no matter how beautiful the fiddling, Rome is still burning, I would say that the poem isn't the place I always need to go for those reminders. But I think that there are some really quiet reminders of something like a non-nationalism, right? Like, you can imagine an Ashbery who only wrote about the Encyclopedia of American Rivers, right? And this poem refuses to do that. This is a poet who's an expat in Paris who's fled the McCarthy-era homophobia in order to go to this place where maybe, fraternity and égalité, etc., actually might mean something, although we know they never mean something that stable anywhere. But so he's outside of America, and he's writing about the poems of the world, I was going to say, the rivers of the world. But also the figure of the river is something that's transnational or non-national, right? Like, it doesn't observe boundaries of nation the way that people have to do at passport checks and so on and so forth. So I think certainly he's indicating his refusal to be provincial by having encyclopedia be global. So there are faint ways to think of politics even through this dissolution of material existence.
Do you think, as an intellectual, that he is refusing politics?
Well, his second book is called The Tennis Court Oath, and it's about a bunch of men locked in a closet deciding that they have political rights, right? So it's sort of a metaphor for the right to visibility and representational equity of queer men at a moment when he's fled McCarthy-era America. And yet that book that's announcing itself so much is in relation to the French political imaginary, starts with poems that are all about America. They dream only of America, etc. And so I don't think he refuses the political at all. I just think you have to sort of pass through France to get back to America often with him. And to things that have to do with queerness as opposed to just how a nation imagines the rights that its citizens get or don't get. But certainly he's a poet who demands that you bring your politics to the poem if you're going to acquire some of his.
I just wanted to ask a question. You talked in two different ways about the formal elements of some of these poems. In the Ashbery, you called them local rules at one point. So you identified the capitalization, for example, as a local rule on the left margin. And later on, when you talk about the sort of more formless poem or the haphazard poem, you talk about intense patterning as another way to kind of talk about how we might view form as readers. I wonder, as a practicing poet, how the idea of patterns or rules function. How does one write with rules or against rules? I'm thinking of formal constraints too, which would be involved.
Are you a plant? Did I pay you? I'm so glad for that question. If you turn to the back of your packet, you'll see the first page of Deleuze's Of the Refrain there. And if I could just read a tiny bit of it, despite how sentimental it sounds. A child in the dark, gripped with fear, comforts himself by singing under his breath. He walks and halts to his song. Lost, he takes shelter or orients himself with his little song as best he can. The song is like a rough sketch of a calming and stabilizing, calm and stable, center in the heart of chaos. Perhaps the child skips as he sings, hastens or slows his pace. But the song itself is already a skip. It jumps from chaos to the beginning of order in chaos, and it is in danger of breaking apart at any moment. There is always sonority in Ariadne's thread, or the Song of Orpheus. I could go on and on because I love this thing. But what I mean is just by including this is to say that a work's boundary is the beginning of work internal relations, right? And I think that producing intense patterning is actually a way to produce the abyssality of relation within that bound of the work. And so I'm interested in finding some way to sort of hedge my bets as a practitioner, where I both want to admit intense patterning, but like Ashbery and Whitman, I don't necessarily want to work lockstep within received forms. So I think that our moment is a moment that can be productively characterized as a moment when one wants to produce a serious relation to archival forms without simply inertly replicating them, which is just to say that maybe we're still in Eliot's moment from the free verse essay, right? That like these kinds of effects have to flare productively within a work rather than being the entire work itself. When I read tomorrow, I'm going to end with a very small excerpt from a 40-page prose poem that's written in a relentless iambic rhythm. So for me, that's about narrating the disappearance of meter as an available form within poetry. I'm sort of describing the fall of music into prose, where visually it looks like it's just prose that has none of those rules that lineation can avail itself of, but a lot of those effects have been imported into the space of prose. So I'm interested in watching form break up on the rocks rather than looking at something that's already broken up. Which is not to say that I don't love the Kevin Davies poem, because I utterly do. But I think from its title, Lateral Argument, it's already in some ways a lament about brokenness. And it's using brokenness to think that fact both as a fact of writing poetic forms today and living today.
One poem we didn't talk about in our class yesterday, we were discussing your book, was the Sestina. And I wonder if you could talk about the experience of writing this, since you're just talking about the iambic prose poem. One thing that struck me about the Sestina was that it seemed as if the speaker of the poem is deliberately trying not to allow the formal constraint of the Sestina to change the way that he speaks. So that, in a way, it seemed to me as if one project of the poem was to resist a change in style when the form, in fact, was very different from the form of many of the other poems.
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I'd say that much like writing iambic prose, it's a way of seeing whether I can rehabilitate a traditional resource of the archive without feeling like I'm bringing along with it all the kinds of freightednesses that might turn readers off or make it an inert replication. So for one thing, it's not simply a sestina, it's a rhyme sestina. Right? There are 3 pairs of rhyme words, and these rhyme words are about as boring as words can be. Normally, a sestina, as part of its abyssality and sleight of hand, legerdemain, wants to use low-frequency terms, usually substantives, right? Like it wants to use grandmother in Bishop, right? Or it wants to use Kathmandu in Donald Justice, right? Or it wants to use painter. Actually, is painter one of them in the painter, in the Ashbery sestina? I don't remember. But anyway, but mine are what, that, where, there, when, then. And so basically what I thought is, let me use this low frequency form to see whether that's a place in which, through its endless recombination of n-words, rhyme plays differently, so that rhyme doesn't look nostalgic. And let me rhyme really boring function words, right, that aren't really the content of the poem. And let me see if that's a kind of articulation, rearticulation, that maybe is formally useful in the same way that the variations on flow can be in the beginning of the Ashbery poem that we have in front of us. So it was just a self-dare about whether there was a way to use rhyme by using it in the location where we never think of it as happening, because a sestina is the place where all the words are rhyming with themselves across each sestet, right? So in a way, rhyme is implicit in the logic of the sestina and also completely absent and inaudible. And I wanted to see, well, let me actually make rhyme happen there and have it be just as inaudible as when it doesn't happen.